kit to provide printing. Recently, we find out the privilege of having Don Hutcheson present an explanation of the G7 process at one of our annual Connections with Conferences. Don Hutcheson is the inventor of the G7 process. With more than 40 years of experience in photography, design, pre-prints, printing, and color science, Don has pioneered many techniques that we don't take for granted, like RGB workflows, step printing, extended gamut printing, and inkjet proofing, and of course, the G7 process. The G7 process has made standardized printing and proofing easier and more accessible to thousands of printers and print buyers worldwide. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Don Hutcheson.
Just quickly, how many of you folk already are using EFI RIPs and EFI printing devices? Wonderful. How many of you are using G7 that you know of? What? Great. You guys can leave. You already know this stuff. How many people here are technical? Do you actually work on the software and so on? Are any of you business owners or sales or marketing, anything like that? Okay, cool. Well, welcome. Thanks very much. What I'm going to try to do this morning is give you an overview of, first of all, what is G7. And mostly I want to focus on the benefits of G7 for EFI users, specifically wide format and super wide format. Then I'll talk very briefly about what's called the G7 Master Program. You may or may not have heard of it. Anyone here actually a G7 Master? Great. Hey, it's preaching to the converted. Yeah. And then I'll show you how easy it is now, recently, to put G7 into the EFI proServer. And then finally, I'll end up with how you can get started with G7. So as you can tell by looking at me, this hair is not colored. This is the real me. I've been in the industry for 48 years. I was sitting with Lou Prestia this morning. I said it's 46 years. And I realized, holy cow, that was 2 years ago. 48 years, that's a long time. And as you can see that back in the early days in 1968, there was something in the water. I don't know what it was. They were putting drugs in the water, I think it was. But back then my philosophy was the typical hippie philosophy. Hey man, the only thing constant is change. And as I got older, I became lazier. And I realized that necessity is not the mother of invention. Laziness is the mother of invention. And I've had a lot of fun with this industry. I love photography. I've basically spent 48 years playing. This is my hobby. You know, I hate it when I only have a 40-hour week. I'd rather work a lot harder. On the left there, you see the very first scanner I ever operated in 1969 in Auckland, New Zealand. And it was a monster. It is now actually a boat anchor in Auckland Harbor. It was so heavy. It was over a ton of cast iron. And today, that same technology, only on steroids, can be had in any DSLR. Average time to print back in 1969 was about 3 or 4 days. You'd had to take a photograph, have it developed, you'd scan it, you'd make plates, you'd run some proofs. The client say, no, not good enough. You'd run some more proofs, you'd etch the plates and so on. Finally, you'd get the printing done 3 or 4 days later. Today, if you have a desktop printer or one of these large format devices out there, you can take a picture and be printing the thing 10 minutes later. It's measured in minutes. So the world has changed a lot. But back then, as a young apprentice on this scanner, there's one item on that scanner that really intrigued me, the oscilloscope. Wow, man, we could see these wiggly lines. If you knew what you're doing, if you were a TV technician, you could actually work out something about the color. But it was totally and completely meaningless. The way you operated this was dial and oscilloscope. You didn't get to see the picture. And I remember looking at that thing and thinking, you know, there's got to be a way we could hook up a TV screen to this, so that I could actually scan the original and see what it was going to look like long before it was printed. Of course, everyone laughed at me. Well, I'm happy to say that about 16 years later, I actually introduced the very first soft proofing system in the world. In 1984, the ICG scanner had this little thing. And this resulted from a meeting I had in London with the designer of the scanner, where I said, can't you just hook up a TV set to it? He said, oh, no, it would be impossible. So we got a napkin, and I drew on the napkin how I thought the software should work. And about 6 months later, we came out with this thing. And it totally revolutionized scanner operating. Because back in 1984, we could adjust that so that it looked very, very much like a printed sheet. We could have people who had never operated a scanner before, literally truck drivers in a newspaper. We could train them how to operate the scanner. That was inspired by laziness. And it was an invention that I'm very proud of. It eliminated guesswork, improved quality, reduced costs, and all my career I've been looking for ways to simplify operation and simplify this whole graphic arts process. So back in about 1979, when I came to America, I was demonstrating scanners. That's not illustrated here. Actually, it was the one on that previous slide, come to think of it. But it was very difficult because we had two proofing systems. We had chromalin, which was a positive proofing system, and matchprint, which was negative. And the same settings didn't work on the two. So I developed a system, which back then I called press to proof, that allowed me to do one print and measure one scale, and I could change the settings on the scanner so that the films that came out would look remarkably similar on those two proofing systems. To say they were exactly the same would be a lie, but I wouldn't say that a lie, obviously, to you guys, because you're all very nice. That later on became the G7 process in 2004. I donated this process to Idealliance, who now own the G7 technology, and it's done a lot to really improve the industry. Now, in 2006, as chairman of the GRACOL project, we came out with the GRACOL color space. And I don't know if you realize how important this was. This was done at the same time that in Germany, Foga came out with some Foga color spaces. Basically what we did is we took ICC technology and concepts, and we defined what good offset printing should look like once and for all, and published it as a characterization data set. Now, if that sounds fancy, think of it as an ICC profile. We said, look, this is how good offset printing should look. And it revolutionized the industry because suddenly proofing and printing was aiming at a constant standard. I shouldn't really call it a standard, but it really was a standard. Now, we used the ISO standard for printing as much as we could. The one thing that we changed was we used this P2P calibration, which is now called G7. And as of literally 10 years ago, the whole printing world has become a lot easier because suddenly we're aiming at the same color standard. We're not saying, oh, well, how does this press print? Let's make our files for that. How does that one print? Let's make our files for this one. Now we can actually have files that are generated independently of knowing how they're going to print, and someone can say, here's the proof, here's how it should look. You probably don't realize what a major change that was to the whole industry. So this brings me to a main part of the presentation. I know a lot of you understand what G7 is, but I'm contracted to give this presentation to people who might not know, and I see one person in marketing. Great, so this is for you. All of you other people, close your eyes if you've already seen this. G7 is basically a standardized definition of how black and white printing should look, just grayscale printing. And you may think, well, what's that got to do with color? Well, the fact is that black and white is the crucial backbone on which color printing can be defined. So what we define are two functions, two visual aspects of how we see or how we speak about a gray. The first aspect is called tonality, i.e. lightness and contrast. The second one is something you're probably more familiar with, which is gray balance. Now, I want to actually define those for you so you understand what I'm talking about. So here are three reproductions of the same black and white image, and tonality simply describes the overall lightness, darkness, and contrast. It's one word that expresses lightness, darkness, and contrast all together. It's taken out of the photographic world, basically. So on the left you see light tonality, on the right you see dark tonality, and in the middle you see something that is probably generally regarded as pleasing looking. And that would be how G7 defines it. So what we're saying is that any process, any printing process, even when it's not ICC profiled, as long as it's G7 calibrated, it will always reproduce that picture looking very much like the one in the middle. Not too light, not too dark, not too much contrast, not enough, just exactly right. Now, gray balance, it should be obvious to you, but here again is the same image reproduced with bad gray balance on the left and right and neutral gray balance in the middle. When we say gray balance, we're simply saying when we print with CMY or CMYK inks and we don't have an apparent color cast or color bias. So hopefully that defines what gray balance is for you. Now, G7 is a little bit more than just that definition. What made it successful, we basically published this in 2005, 2006. What made it successful was it was actually I keep on hitting that slide thing twice, don't I? It's a one-step calibration system that can be used for any printing system at all. Regardless of the inks, regardless of the device, regardless of the substrate, as long as you have a rip that will take curves in it, G7 calibration will produce the same result on any device very quickly, very easily. So it's a universal calibration system that applies not just to offset printing, but to inkjet and flexo and screen and gravure, you name it. So to understand the significance of it, let's look at the profiling sequence. Most of you, I presume, are familiar with ICC profiles and how valuable they are. It's an amazing, fabulous technology. It's about 20 years old, which totally revolutionized this whole industry. But in the process of creating an ICC profile, you've got to be careful to do things in the right order. The first thing you must do is stabilize the system. By that, I mean pick a substrate, pick an ink, pick a printing mode, and don't vary, don't deviate from that. If you change the substrate, change the ink, you'll probably need another ICC profile. The second thing you have to do is calibrate the system, and I'll go into more on that in just a moment. Then we do what's called characterizing, and that's where you print the target with all the patches. I'll show you a picture of that in a couple of minutes. And you measure them with a spectrophotometer, and that produces now a file that says, well, when I printed these CMYK values, here's the lab values I got. And then finally, you drop that into a software like the EFI, what's the profiling software? Color Profiler Suite, and out pops an ICC profile. That's the easy part. Creating the profile, that's done by the software. The critical part in this whole section that I'm going to focus on is calibration. This is where G7 comes in, and where G7 has actually made a significant improvement to the process of creating ICC color profiles. So if we first of all define what calibration means, that means bringing a printer to a known, predictable, repeatable state. Ideally, calibration should bring a printer back to the same visual appearance that it had the last time and the first time it was calibrated. Unfortunately, not all traditional calibration systems do that, but this is something that G7 was designed specifically to do. What G7 does is it introduces a logical, universal, standard calibration appearance that's more effective and more powerful than traditional calibration. And that now makes me need to define what I mean by traditional calibration. Traditional calibration, and this has been used for donkey's years, it's been around for 30 or 40 years, is based on a very sensible, logical concept where we say, look, we've defined what the solid inks are. We know what the paper is. Let's define the tonality of each individual ink, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, in between 0 and 100%. And it makes a lot of sense when you first hear about it. We're basically saying, let's control the individual components that go to make the color. But it has a couple of fatal flaws. Here you see the ISO standard TVI curves. These are actually old ones. They've been replaced by new ones. But basically, the International Standards Organization has defined TVI calibration based on some tests that were done on offset printing. And that's all very well. Problem is, even on an offset printing process, just going to these constant TVI curves doesn't necessarily guarantee a constant appearance. Your gray balance can actually be different, even though two offset presses have identical TVI curves. Your tonality can actually be different, even though two offset presses use the same TVI curve. So it's not a very effective way of getting the most bang for your buck from calibration. What's worse is that now that printing is no longer just in the offset realm, the last 10 or 20 years, we've seen an explosion of new printing devices and technologies that aren't at all like offset. So if we try to take the ISO standard TVI curves for offset and apply them, for example, to inkjet, we don't get any useful results at all. Here you can actually see the result of, this is actually 3 offset printing presses, printing in different conditions with the same TVI curves. You can see on the left it's very dark and reddish. On the right it's kind of greenish. In the middle it's the way it was meant to be. So the TVI calibration, although it makes a lot of sense logically, doesn't get the most out of the capability of what we do at that critical stage called calibration. So this is where G7 comes in, and using a very, very simple concept that is really very, very old. I basically stole it from photography. We say, instead of looking at the individual ink curves, let's look at how they work together. So we print a black scale, and then we print a 3-color scale, where we've actually prearranged that the CMY values on that 3-color scale are in what we expect to be the correct gray balance mode. And then we test it to see, is it neutral gray? Does it have the right tonality? And if it doesn't, we fix it, again, using the same type of calibration curve. So it defines tonality and gray balance. And what we get now is a solving of the limitations of traditional calibration. What G7 produces that traditional cal doesn't do is what we call shared neutral appearance with any ink, any substrate, any printing system. By shared neutral appearance, I'm basically saying similar gray balance and tonality. And here is a picture showing you what I mean by that. This is 3 devices. A shared neutral appearance means that on the left we have a digital printer. I think it was a Konica Minolta, I can't remember. Out of the box, it was light and it was reddish. In the middle is an Epson inkjet printer. This was done a few years ago. Out of the box, it was kind of dark and greenish, and on the right was an offset press. Simply using the G7 curves, we got a result like what you see at the bottom. Very, very much closer. Now, this is without ICC color management. We're getting the grays right in terms of tonality and gray balance. But if you look carefully at the golf ball, you'll see that the golf ball looks different, doesn't it? Why is that? Anyone know why the golf ball looks different? Because the ink colors are different. So what G7 has done is it's carefully controlled the grays, but it hasn't done what color management would do. To get that golf ball to look the same, you'd have to use some color management. I'm going to ask you a question, though. Which of those golf balls is the right one? Anyone play golf here? They all look pretty good, don't they? Does it really matter? The point is they're all pleasing reproductions, even though we don't necessarily know which is the right golf ball. Now I'm going to click with my little clicker thing. Maybe that'll behave itself better. It works on not just golf balls. It works on people, too. These are exactly the same printing devices. You can see that we had some pretty ugly results at the top in the flesh tones. And at the bottom, although they're not exactly the same, they are all, again, pleasing color. The one in the middle, the flesh tones look a little richer, so do the fabrics. Why is that? Because the inkjet printer has a much higher color gamut. But the grays are good, the tonality is good, and overall, they're 3 acceptable reproductions. We don't know which one is right unless we saw a proof. So is G7 then the same as ICC color management? No, it is not. It would be misleading to pretend that G7 replaces color management. Of course, it does not. It is, however, a gray management philosophy, and it does work as gray management. If you only want your grays managed, then you can use G7 alone. Full color management would require that you coupled this with an ICC profile made after you did your G7 calibration. You can actually get quite good color with ICC alone. Many people will say that. Why do I need G7? I've got an ICC profile. The point is that G7 actually enhances the quality and the effectiveness as ICC color management, as I will show you in just a moment. The core concept of G7 is that gray balance and tonality can be controlled by curves alone. By curves, I mean either Photoshop curves or RIP curves, anywhere that you've got curves. Now, every printing process on Earth has a stage in the RIP or the workflow where curves are applied to the individual inks. And it just so happens that grays, that family known as grays, which includes, by the way, white and black, can be completely controlled, both in terms of tonality and gray balance, only by using curves. That's the one color family that can be completely color managed with curves. And if we improve the grays, if we get the grays right, automatically the colors go in the right direction, as you just saw with the golf balls and the musicians. And this is a 100-year-old secret of color photography. Photography has been my passion since long before I joined this industry. And guess what, folks? Printing is photography. All those printers out there, what are they reproducing? 99% of the time, photographs. Printing and photography are the same technology. They're the same business. So the same rules that work for photography work also for printing. And here's an illustration of how an extreme case of a bad original. This was an underwater photograph done on one of these little cheap digital housings. And I was able to fix the color entirely using curves. No brushwork, no masking, nothing at all, simply by finding the white point, which I believe was this little bubble up here, and maybe a gray, which is probably somewhere on his belt there, and the black, which isn't there. Simply by clicking that in Photoshop using red, green, and blue curves, because in photography, RGB are the natural curves, we get not only a restoration of gray balance, but suddenly colors that had not even been visible in the original pop out. I love this. I don't know about you, but I think this is amazing. Is this amazing? No, it's boring? Say it's amazing. Okay, thank you. So this is an illustration of why G7 is so powerful. Now, why is gray special? Gray is special because if you think of the color families we learned of at high school or as children, we were told that there was red, green, and blue, cyan, magenta, yellow. You might have seen that color circle where red is opposite cyan, green is opposite magenta, and so on. There is a 7th color family. It's called grays. And grays are the one color family that we can say are right or wrong simply by looking at it without any education at all. You could get people off the streets, as long as they weren't too drunk right now, and you could show them pictures I'm about to show you, and they could tell you which one was gray and which one was not. Grays appear correct to the eye when they seem to match the paper or the substrate on which they are printed. So here's a test for you. You didn't know you were going to be tested, did you? All right. This is a test. These are 3 reproductions of a picture taken not very far from here. This was in Death Valley. And you have to tell me which one of these is the most neutral gray or the most gray balanced. And of course, we're using the road as a surrogate for a gray target. Anyone? Left, right, middle? Right? Yes, you're all right. Now I'm going to make it a little harder. I've reduced the error now, and I've shuffled them around. Which one do you like best now? Think about it carefully. Lunch depends on this, by the way. Yes, it is the left. Yeah, who said that? Give that man free lunch. Yeah. Very good. All right, so that just showed you that gray is a very, very important color. Getting grays right is as important as getting your solid inks or anything else right. So that was the theory. That was the basis behind it. Let's now look at the benefits of G7, especially for you EFI users. As you can see, the benefits correspond to a big stack of notes. What are those hundreds? Yeah, hundreds. Haven't they changed the $100 note? I can't remember. So I'm going to summarize them here on this slide. Basically, you may not get this same mileage, obviously. Not everyone sees all these advantages, but the reports we've had over the last 10 years since G7 was introduced were, first of all, quality, consistency, ability to reach standards or standardization, efficiency, that's dollar saving, safety, what, safety? Yeah, I'm going to show you safety in a minute, flexibility, and customer value or brand appeal. So let's first look at quality. How does G7 improve color accuracy? How can it improve color accuracy? If I already have an ICC profiling technology, what is G7 going to do to help me? Well, the truth is, under some circumstances, you may not see the difference. But by doing G7 first before you build your ICC profile, you are actually relieving the profiling software of some of the work it has to do. Remember, gray is just one of dozens or hundreds or thousands of colors that may be on a profiling target. A profiling software has to share its energy equally amongst all those colors. If we get gray balance and tonality right before we even print the profiling target, the profiling software now has to work much less hard. It says, well, grays are already done. I can focus all of these target patches on getting the subtle color, the colored areas right. G7 focuses on subtle grays while the ICC focuses on subtle colors. And the answer for why that is if we look at the standard profiling targets. On the left is a target with a name that really just rolls off the tongue. It's the IT8.7/4. That's what groups, scientific groups are there for, to give funny names to things. But this is the standard profiling target with 1,617 patches in it, 2 of which are grays. So proportionally, compared to all the other colors, gray doesn't get a very good representation in here. This is a wonderful target for making sure your red apples and your blue skies and your flesh tones are looking good. But if you try to get super grays after building an ICC profile, depending on the condition that your printer was originally in, it may not be very good. However, if we first run this target on the right, which is known as the P2P target, that has 50 gray patches. It has 50 shades of gray, if I'm allowed to say that. That's probably copyrighted, but I'm going to say it anyway. So getting the grays right first. Now, when that profile target goes out, on top of that calibration, the profiling software doesn't have to do anything more. Now, this isn't just hot air. I do speak a lot of hot air. My wife actually says that wherever I'm standing, the room is always about 5 degrees warmer. It's very rude of her, isn't it, to say that? But she's a good woman anyway. G7 actually can improve your measured color accuracy. As some of you will know, color accuracy is measured with a unit known as delta E. I won't go into the details right now. If you do ICC profiling based on G7 calibration, the average delta E that we've observed is typically between 25 and 33% better, that is smaller, than if you simply did ICC profiles alone. You won't always see that. But if you start off with a printing device that is in a very non-gray balanced condition, you can frequently find that kind of difference. But really, that's not the big thing, because quite honestly, you're not going to see that difference. Already, an ICC profile alone is going to make the color look really, really good. Unless you are really, really nitpicking, you may not notice this difference. The big difference is consistency. So let's look at how G7 can actually contribute to consistency. If the initial ICC profile you make for a printer, like a ViewTech or whatever, is made after careful G7 calibration, then any variations in the printer, which are going to happen, deal with it, it just happens. You know, batch variations, humidity variations, paper variations, can be corrected by simply recalibrating to G7 instead of reprofiling. Why is that important? Because recalibration is a lot faster, a lot cheaper, and a lot easier. What G7 does is it brings it back to the appearance with the same gray balance, same tonality as when the profile was built. So, hey presto, we don't need to print a new profiling target. Unless, of course, you've done something really ridiculous, like buying a different type of ink, like a warm red instead of a magenta, or you've put a completely different paper in. Yes, then you'd need a new ICC profile. But if the materials are the same, you don't need a new profile. G7 calibration is faster, it's easier, it's cheaper, ching ching, and it's safer than reprofiling. Now, why is consistency important? What does it actually mean to you as the owner of a print shop or a printing device? It means consistent color day to day, consistent color device to device. If you have multiple printers in the same roof, under the same roof, you'd like them all to be consistent and match as close as possible to each other. Consistent color location to location. Many of you work probably for distributed printing organizations, and you'd like to be able to offload the work to another location, maybe the same town, or maybe distribute it across the country to shorten your delivery costs. Mostly, though, one of the big things is consistent reprints. You pick up a sample that you printed 6 months ago, and you have to print it again. As long as you were calibrated to G7 and had a good profile 6 months ago, your results are going to look very, very similar again today. And that translates, by the way, to fewer remakes, which is a big cost saving. But one of the interesting things is it gives you more consistent match of industry standard pre-press proofs. And this takes us back now to what I mentioned earlier about GRACOL and swap. So how does G7 actually improve standardized printing? Remember that much and all as inkjet and digital have expanded enormously in the last 10 to 20 years, offset printing is still the 600-pound gorilla of printing. Virtually all packaging, virtually all publication work is still done in offset. And it was there first. It's the first one for which any standards were implemented. So the result is that today, 99% of all the CMYK files you might get delivered to you from, let's say, an agency, a brand, a publisher, a designer, whatever, are probably going to be in either the GRACOL or the swap color space, because those are the standard definitions of color here in America. If it's in Germany, it's probably going to be in FOGA, which, guess what, looks so close to GRACOL and swap, it's not funny. So these are the definitions. The standard definition of CMYK has become essentially an offset definition. 99% of all the proofs you are likely to get from an agency or a brand are probably going to be in GRACOL or swap color space. So if you're operating an inkjet printer or a flexo or a dye sublimation printer or something, being able to match GRACOL or swap is a basic fundamental necessity on some type of work. Even though it's true to say that most of the inkjet printers out there today have a considerably larger color gamut and can do much richer color than you'd get in offset. But that doesn't matter. Being able to match it is one of the first requirements. So how does G7 help to match these industry standards? Well, the tonality and the gray balance of GRACOL and swap are based on G7. In fact, G7 evolved while we developed the GRACOL and the swap color spaces in 2006. It actually defines the gray backbone inside the GRACOL color space or GRACOL proof or GRACOL printing process. Simply calibrating to G7 is going to match any printing device to the tonality and gray balance of GRACOL within certain provisos. Obviously, paper color can affect it, and the amount of ink you put down may affect the shadows, but basically it's going to look very, very similar. You add an ICC profile on top of that for an even closer color match, depending on the quality of the work you're looking for. Another really cool thing about G7, though, is because it's based on photographic principles, essentially it's based on a 100-year-old knowledge that tonality and gray balance are the basis of a good color reproduction. G7 is going to guarantee pleasing color even if no color management is applied. For example, when a file comes in without an embedded profile. Remember, G7 is based on photographic principles. And it also means less chance of error if the wrong profile is applied. So now let's look at efficiency. How can you say G7 contributes to efficiency? Well, if you calibrate all your printers first before you make your profiles, then actually multiple printers of the same type can share very often one ICC profile. I had a client about a year ago who had 6 Epson dye sublimation printers running 24 hours a day. They wore them out every 6 months. So they were constantly replacing 1 or 2 at a time. And they were pulling their hair out because they had 6 different profiles, 6 different workflows, but they didn't know the night before when they were preparing the files which one it was going to go to. A total nightmare. We G7 calibrated them all. We made a profile of all of them and looked at we averaged the 3 profiles, the 6 profiles. Bingo. We didn't need it anymore. So suddenly these people now have a much easier workflow distribution capabilities. Their efficiency went through the roof. Now, it also is more efficient when it comes to color maintenance. Maintaining your color management is just as important as creating it. ICC profiling is not a one-moment event. It's not I did it, it's done. It's not a January event. It's an ongoing event. Maintaining color performance and color accuracy is an essential part of good and profitable printing. If you G7 calibrate all your printers first, instead of reprofiling, all you have to do is recalibrate. Calibration is faster and it's easier than profiling. If the printer drifts, and they all are going to drift, I mean, I don't care who you are, your printer is probably going to drift from time to time. Simply recalibrating to G7 restores the conditions under which the ICC profile was made in the first place, so you get to use the same profile. Now, I'm cutting a few corners here. There may be some of you who have such demanding clients that you choose to make a new profile. That's absolutely fine, but 99% of you don't need to do that. As long as you didn't change your media or your ink, it's going to work just fine to recalibrate. Now, G7 is actually safer. It avoids the dangers of profiling. Dangers? What the hell is this guy talking about? What's G7 equals safety mean? This is Don, you're losing it. Those 48 years, I think maybe the senility is setting in. Let me explain to you what I mean. G7 does actually make color safer. I've been spending the last 20 years as a color management consultant teaching people how to make ICC profiles. About the last 15 years, I've been teaching them how not to make a profile unless you absolutely need to. Because in the first 5 years, I discovered some nightmares that I hadn't anticipated. And that is that creating an ICC profile is not nearly as easy or as safe as it may look. All you need is one patch to go wrong, and you can get essentially an explosion, a time bomb. This is actually a replay of a real event. I walked into People magazine in 1997 on a Friday afternoon. They said, "Oh, Don, it's a good thing you're here. We've got a bit of a problem." It wasn't this picture, but you see what's happening on the right there? It was a front page of People magazine, and we had isobars like a weather map going through this woman's flesh tones. I said, when did you last profile? Well, it can't be the profile. We made a new profile this morning. Smoking gun. I figured maybe it is today's. Let's just use last week's profile, shall we? And bingo, things came out right. We did a little research. We found that one patch on the target had a blemish on it. It had blistered. It was a synthetic proofing system. And that one patch happened to be a flesh tone patch. So the profile obediently said, oh, these CMYK values produce this pasty white look. And I'm going to show you that patch. You see it there? Can you see it? I'll help you out. I'm zooming in. It's that middle patch. Now, unfortunately, that middle patch happens to be a very important patch. And you see what it did to the flesh tone. Isn't that amazing? Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen to you every day, but it only has to happen once. And the worst part about this is it's a time bomb. You may not notice it for weeks until a job comes along where that patch is critical to that image. So ICC profiling can be a little bit dangerous, just to warn you. Flexibility is one of the other really cool things about G7, though. Something that people really do like about flexibility is it gives, at the sales level and at the production level, a couple of opportunities you don't get without G7. First of all, G7 does work on any printing system, any inks, any substrates, so long as the RIP is compatible with curves. That's the big caveat. Some RIPs out there still are not compatible with G7, but I'm happy to say more and more are becoming G7 compliant. And in a few minutes, I'll show you just how easy it is to put G7 into the EFI proServer. But the cool thing about G7 is it gives you similar appearance across devices, media locations, with or without ICC color management. So that's the kind of flexibility that most people would think of. And if we look at the number of different printing systems, if I simply say any printing system, it's amazing how many people come up after and say, yeah, but Don, does it work on Flexo? Yep. Does it work on screen? Yep. Does it work on dye sublimation? Yep. So I thought I'd list them to save you having to ask these questions. So offset, Flexo, gravure, inkjet, electrophotography, that means digital like like a Canon CLC or a Konica Minolta or an Indigo. Screen printing, if you're still involved in screen printing, my commiserations if you are. Dye sublimation printing, whether it's inkjet or offset based. Photographic printing. Yes, I have a couple of labs. There's still a few photographic labs. They use G7 on their the lambdas so that their 3-color CMY printing on photographic paper looks good. If I missed a printing system, please let me know afterwards. Anyone know of a printing system I didn't cover here? I covered them all, I think, yeah. But there's another flexibility that's really kind of cool, and this is something that Indigo and Canon and Konica Minolta picked up on very, very early in the day. As soon as they started using G7, they discovered something really cool, that they could actually print either with G7 and ICC color management, which is the de rigueur method of working when someone says, hey, match that offset run I did last week. Even though your inkjet has got a bigger space, just match GRACOL. Or they can switch off color management, leave G7 on, and get naturally and automatically the full color gamut of that printing device. This matters a lot for inkjet and digital. So we actually call that in Idealliance, we call it G7 Extreme, which is great when the client walks in and says, look, this is a poster. For God's sake, give me all the color. It doesn't have to match anything else. Just give me all the color you can. And here's what it looks like, and I hope this shows up on the screen. Can you see a color gamut or color saturation improvement on the right? Yeah, good. I was beating up the poor videographer. I wanted all the lights down so we didn't ruin the screen, but I think we made a nice sort of compromise here. Yes, on the left you see GRACOL. This is the same exact CMYK file, printed on GRACOL on the left and printed on a ViewTech on the right. But if you look at the flesh tones, if you look at the tonality, they're very, very similar. In other words, bingo, without any effort at all, we're just saying, let's get the full color gamut. Now, you might say, oh, yes, but the hues have changed. Yeah, we know that. We're not talking about accurate color, we're talking about saturated color here. This is a saleable option. There's a lot of printers out there that actually have now put that into their sales sheet. They say, hey, would you like regular GRACOL or would you like G7 Extreme? Your G7 Extreme may look different from someone else's depending on the inks you're using, but it's just a nice little freebie you get automatically when you use the G7 process. Perhaps one of the biggest advantages, though, of G7 is brand appeal. I don't know if you're aware of it, but many brands, agencies, designers, publishers today will only accept work from G7 printers. How do they find them? They go to the G7 master database at idealliance.org. So becoming a G7 master puts your company in a searchable database, and it's going to attract some of the major clients. I can't name them, virtually all of them don't want to be named, but think of any company that does a lot of consumer goods, that makes a lot of bottled fizzy drinks. Both of those guys are probably doing it. A lot of the packaging companies out there, a lot of the major brands that make shoes and cars only will buy now print from G7 masters. Why do brands like G7? Well, here's the official list. A G7 master company, someone who's actually received training and become a G7 master, is going to produce more consistent color than someone who hasn't necessarily done that. Or at least that's the story. And in most cases, it's true. They can match standard proofs, GRACOL or swap proofs, more accurately, more efficiently, more easily without going through multiple rounds. They can produce repeatable reprints. You send the same job in after 6 months. We ran out of boxes. We want some more boxes. They're going to look exactly the same. It's hair coloring, whatever. There's a better chance of getting that from a G7 master than from someone who hasn't had that kind of training. They can match color on a wider range of devices and media. Now, once again, any one of these arguments, you could shoot a hole in it and say, oh, no, no, no. Someone just knowing ICC color management could do that. And I'll agree with that up to a certain point. But the trick is that once you've been through the G7 master training, we know, the brand knows that you have a superior set of color management skills. There's no question about it. We know you've had a very thorough training that includes G7 and ICC color management. And you're probably going to solve problems faster. You want to know really why brands love G7, why it's so successful? I didn't want to put it on the slide because it's too funny. It's because G7 is easier to spell than ICC. Well, actually, probably about the same. But G7 is a very catchy name, and it really means, okay, here's a company, a G7 master, they must be doing something right. So let's have a quick look at the G7 master program. It's run by Idealliance. Idealliance is a not-for-profit organization. I do a lot of work for them. Combination of the G7 technology and Idealliance's reach throughout the industry worldwide has helped to make G7 very, very popular and very successful. So the G7 Master Program, that's at the top of the list. This is a printer, such as one of your companies, that has received training from a G7 expert and then had their samples submitted and been verified as matching G7, and you go on the website. What is a G7 expert? A G7 expert that's had certification training from Idealliance. I usually do that training. It's about a 3-day course. They've been through it from soup to nuts. I know there are some G7 experts in the room today, and they are qualified to go out and train a company like yours to become a G7 master. There's also the G7 Professional Program. If you are a large enough company and you want to actually have it in-house, you can send one of your people for the G7 Professional training, and they now can actually turn you into a G7 master. You get a little bit of a cost saving and some extra training by doing it that way. Here is the G7 Master Database. So a brand or a publisher or an agency looking for G7 Masters is going to go to Idealliance. They're going to click on the certifications. They're going to go to G7 Master Qualification, and then they'll say what state we want to look at, and eventually out will pop. I've just found one here from Las Vegas. Creel Printing. Is Creel Printing in the room today? You're getting free advertising here. So this makes you much more visible to those people who may be in your area or looking for printing in your area. Now, G7 in Fiery proServer is something I really want to touch on here for a minute. Some pretty cool things have been happening. For a long while, a lot of RIPs were not very compatible with G7. EFI was one of those RIPs that in the old days wasn't particularly compatible. You could do it, but it was tricky. The exciting news is that G7 is now very, very compatible, very easy to put into the proServer. Basically, this is how you do it. You start out with a printer, obviously a Vutec. It only works with Vutex. No, I'm lying. Of course it works with anything. You print the P2P target. You measure it on an automated measuring device. You drop the data into a software like Curve3, which full disclosure, that's my own software with Steve Upton at Chromix. There are other software packages out there that will also do it. And then you enter the values into the proServer, and bingo, you are now G7 calibrated. It's very, very quick. Basically, as fast as it takes to print and measure that, and you can just export the data directly into the proServer. So here we have an image of the Curve3 software showing the raw data. And you can see by these curves, the green line is where we want it to be. This is a density vertical versus percentage here. This is the 3-color grayscale, was too light. And the black was a little heavy. This was too light. This was actually it was an HS 100. And here we see gray balance is going way, way to greeny bluish. Those of you who know LAB can see that's not a good gray balance. G7 correction values are calculated automatically. See, it's saying, let's push the magenta and push the yellow, which will cancel the greeny bluish cast. Pull the black down a little, which will cancel that excess black. And here are the numbers. Now, in the old days, you could type those numbers into the proServer, Fiery proServer, but it was slow, it was tedious, and most importantly, it was error-prone. There was a big chance that it was going to go wrong, and it actually was it made you reluctant to do it because it took so long to do it. The cool thing is, the new change is this. Now, we have a little pop-up here at the bottom of the Curve3 software. There's EFI.VCC, Visual Correction Curve. We export that, we load it into proServer here. Bingo, my G7 curve. You have to name it my G7 curve. If you don't name it my G7 curve, it won't work. Just kidding. Of course, you can name it anything you like. And if you don't remember how to do it, there's a nice little cheat sheet, and I believe it was passed out on the table here, and you can go online to get it. There's a little QR code here to explain how it's done. That's Steve Upton, who wrote the software. I designed the algorithm. He wrote the software, so he gets his picture on there. And this has made Fiery proServer now my favorite RIP for G7. It is so easy to do it. It's just not funny. So just to refresh your memory, here's how the bad results looked, and here's how it looked after calibration. This is actually a real Vutec, and this was a one pass, one step. We didn't have to iterate. We got the grays right first time. Then we went and we built an ICC profile, of course, which sat on top of that. So I'm actually running ahead. Although we started late, I'm just about finished here, so we'll have plenty of time either for questions or, wait a second, this is a hotel. Do they have a bar here? Maybe we could go to the bar afterwards. So let's just finish off by looking at how do you get started with G7. How do you become a G7 master? A G7 master is a lot easier than that. You hire a G7 expert who comes in and trains your operators, typically your lead operator, maybe a couple of others. The one who currently takes care of your color management, that would be the person that you'd have trained. You will probably have to buy some G7 calibration software and possibly some equipment if you don't already have a measuring equipment, although most of you already have, I think, an automated C-Lab strip reading device probably. Then, after you've received the training, you print a couple of sample prints, which are mailed off to RIT through a submission to Idealliance. So the G7 expert is the only one who's able to submit you to Idealliance. You can't just call them up and say, hey, I think I'm a G7 master. Unfortunately, you have to go through this process. That way we control the process very, very carefully. We make sure it's done properly. The samples are verified by RIT, and then your name appears on the G7 master database, and you're there for basically a year. Now, who are you going to get your G7 experts from? Let me think. Well, how about EFI? Right now, I believe there's 10 or more. Lou, you might know that. I believe there's about 10 G7 experts on the EFI staff right now. Some of them are in the big room. You can talk to them right now. And what you can get from EFI are some very, very cool packages, very efficient packages focused on your equipment and your RIP that integrate both G7 and ICC color management training. And the G7 Master application is a service that's also available. Here's a slide that EFI provided for me showing the Fiery XF color and workflow services. I believe this is where it says Fiery XF. I think it also means proServer. Is that right? Correct me if I'm wrong. Yep. So you can get G7 Master training with either a 3-day workflow service for advanced workflow users or a 5-day color and workflow service for the beginners who aren't so familiar with color management. And you can also get that as an outside implementation service package as well. Get more information on that. If I click on this, it's probably going to go to the web, so I'm not going to do that. But Fiery XF on-site services at EFI.com will give you more information on how to get G7 services and training from EFI. Now, if you'd like to learn more in general about G7 or color management or EFI services, there are the 3 obvious things to do. Talk to an EFI representative. Go to idealliance.org to learn more about the Idealliance programs, or you can go to my website, hutchcolor.com. And with that, I'm going to thank you very much for listening.